Mr. Bill Moss, AO, Chairman and Founder of Boston Global. Bill, what a pleasure it is to have you on the series. I want to know, the Moss family essentially came to Australia, I think sometime in the 18th century. What do you know of your family history here in Australia?
Both sides of my family were actually here very early in settlement. On my mother's side of the family, Henry Hacking, he was on the First Fleet, and he was a navigator on supply. And he was a pretty interesting guy because he is an explorer. He basically was on a lot of the ships that sailed with Flinders, charted waters. He discovered Port Hacking, that was named after him. And he was very important in the colony here because he found the missing cattle that were stolen by the Aboriginals that the colony relied on, this stock of cattle for breeding, and he found them at a place in Sydney called Cow Pastures, which of course are now pretty famous where Badgerys Creek is going. Yeah. And he was a very interesting guy. Later on he moved on to Tasmania, and he was very significant in charting the Derwent River as well, and a very colourful guy. He was charged with murder twice, and both times he was acquitted, and I'd say a very colourful character for the era.
And your parents, I believe, got married at the young age of 19, and it was obviously in the darkness of World War II. Tell us about your parents.
Well, they were shaped by the Depression. They were hard-working, and they were people that, both of them had to give up schooling opportunities to get a job, to work. And, my mother, had to leave school at, about the age of 13 and work in a factory. She was effectively helping, the other 10 children in the family, feed and get fed and clothing and all that. And so they were workers, they didn't have anything, they just worked, and they were highly intelligent, both of them very highly intelligent. But a good example of people born to an era that are influenced by that era. And they raised a great family, and they were very dominant in my desire to go to university and study. And in fact, both my parents helped me go through university in those days where it was expensive. Had part-time jobs as I had part-time jobs to try and pay for your education. So they were a big impact into my life. My mother's 96 and she still lives on her own in Sydney. Still a very dominant person, and a very articulate person, a wonderful human being.
And you were born in Castlemaine in 1954, Castlemaine in Victoria. What's your earliest childhood memory?
I do remember Castlemaine pretty well. We were in the main street and we lived across the road, and I remember walking what seemed like an eternity up the hill to a little general shop that was there, and we used to go up there and buy things. And I went back about 30 years later and had a look at it, and it wasn't a long way away. It was about 15 metres. So it seemed a long way when you were walking up a hill. But I do remember a bit about Castlemaine. I remember the school, and I remember where we lived and the car we had and all that. I was 6 when I came to Sydney. And my father, it was a good economic lesson actually. My father down there he was running a woolen mill in Castlemaine, and he was in charge of it, and it was a very important job in that time, that era. And ultimately technology came along and people didn't want woolen mills anymore. So he was retrenched and he came back to Sydney, and he got a job working as a gardener, and ultimately after that as a cleaner. And so for a man who was very intellectual and had built a career in the woolen industry, he basically was a victim of technology. And that always, was always with me in the back of my mind about, what does that mean for the next generation? Which people that have built careers and spend a lot of time studying and working their way up through a company are suddenly going to wake up one day with technological change and they're obsolete. And that's happening.
I think you said in your book you obviously moved to Guildford West when you were aged 6, as you said, due to your father's circumstances. You said in the book that no one around you was wealthy, no one had money. Tell us about the upbringing in Guildford West.
Well, it was a poor area. We actually had half a house. We bought half a house. In those days you could build half a house and you either built the front or the back and you build the other half when you could afford it. And so from the street, we had a house. It looked great. It was a 5-row house. It was 2 bedrooms. It could be converted into 3. And when you went out the kitchen, there was a big step, about 1 metre step down the back with a couple of things you stood on to go down to the bathroom and toilet. And of course, we had no septic, tank. We had, the pan was put out every few days for to be collected, and it was a different world. And then when my father finally got some money, we built the back of the house, and we built the steps to go down to the laundry. We brought the laundry in the house, and then we built a garage, and it's pretty much what it is today, actually.
And one day, I think you were aged around about 12 at the time, you wrote a poem that you still remember today. Yeah. Tell us about why you wrote the poem. I think you had an argument with your mum, but tell us what the poem was and why you wrote it.
No, it's like you get inspiration one day and you sit down and you're feeling like, what's life about and all this sort of thing. And I knew in an early age I had some disability. Right? I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't as fast as running as everyone else, and I couldn't catch a cricket ball, and I was slow, and I could never, make the football team or anything like that. And I knew that, and I even had trouble riding a push bike. And I just went in my bedroom one day and I wrote this thing the way I felt, and it was pretty simple. It was, I shall be what I will be, for I will be what I am. Not for one, not for all, but for I. For I am life, and life is me as long as I shall be. And I just wrote it down as quickly as I can say it today, and it's always sat with me. I never really understood what I wrote, and then later in life I went back and analysed it. And what I was really saying was, look, life's about you. You can feel sorry for yourself, you can feel sorry for other people, you can feel angry about something around you, whether it's the environment or work or the economy, or work, anything at all. But ultimately life depends on you, because the day you don't exist is the day there is no life. And so if you want to get yourself right in life, then you have to get your mind right, and you have to work out how you personally can work at your optimum. And that's what that was all about, and that sort of got me thinking a little bit more as I went to uni and things about, well, it's all about you. You study hard, you improve your chances of getting a job. It's not, I'm going to get one because I deserve one. It's, you've got to fight your way up to get it. And so it sort of set my whole mental attitude about, I'm going to put a lot of effort in. And that's what I did. And right through my life, I've always been someone that just works full time. Whether that work is research or reading, or when I could do physical work, it was physical work. And it's all about self-improvement all the time. And of course, if you get that right, you can get the enjoyment out of that as well. And that's the real art in life, balancing it all.
And I think you also mentioned in your book, during your schooling days, you loved maths, you didn't like reading, but one thing that stood out was you'd be daydreaming, you'd look at a light bulb and think, how could that be made better? I
was always what we'd call a creative thinker, and people would always say, well, can't be done. I'd say, well, I'm not sure why it couldn't be done. And I used to, even in the old days, I used to read encyclopedias all the time, and fascinated by history and what people had invented, and I try and rationalise myself. How can that go from, not knowing about that to invent that, and what's the process you go to? And so I was always very inquisitive about change. And again, I always believe change, change is critical to the world, and again, change is what we're all about, and this whole concept of adapting.
And your secondary school, you went to James Roos Agricultural College, and your father, I think, basically not forced you, but encouraged you to go there. What do you think he saw in you then?
Oh, look, I don't know, because in those days I never discussed that with him. I wish I had to, but he wanted me to get the best schooling we could afford, and James Roos was a selective school. And it still tops every year, usually the number one secondary school in New South Wales for university entrances, etc. And I got into it, and I thought, well, I'm in this school, and I've got smart people around me, which was a bit daunting at the time, but it worked, and I think I went on. Left that school, went to uni. I think I was the first one in my year to actually complete a university course. It worked pretty well for me. If I hadn't gone there, I don't know what would have happened.
And you got a government-funded scholarship to Sydney University doing an economics degree. Tell us about your time at university and why you chose economics to study.
You just learn as you grow up. You like certain subjects, you have a good feel for them. And I liked the way that economics was a subject that I could get inside, and it was different. It made sense to me that you play around with simple fundamentals in the monetary system, and you get different outcomes. And I liked that. I liked that a lot. And I also liked geography. Geography was my other subject, so if you like, probably a weird combination of economics and geography. And I didn't realise at the time what that really meant. I did realise a lot later just how important geography was to everything in the world, and where countries are going to, where they've been, trade routes, and political change as well.
And it's fair to say you sort of viewed university, or at least getting a degree, as a transactional experience. Go to university, get the degree, and get out of there. No socialisation or that sort of thing. It's more just about going there, getting the degree, and getting out. When you did finish university, what did you want to do? Well,
it wasn't a matter of what you wanted to do in those days. In those days, you either had money or you didn't have money. And if you didn't have money, you'd never go to university because it was too hard. If you didn't have money, you'd go to university, and people just assumed they'd get a job at the end of it because, there were family contacts, and, someone would give you a job. I came from a different part of Sydney, and I had to work. I didn't think I was, going to top university by any means, and so I had to work, and I worked all the way through university in part-time jobs and weekend jobs and early morning jobs, and I did that, and for me, I just wanted to get out of there. But the number one criteria for me was earning money. And I remember very simply, at the end of the day, in my last year, I got an offer to do honours in economics at Sydney, and I said no. Now, most other students would say yes, another year, you beauty, let's do it. I said no, because I sat down and simply worked out the amount of money I could have earned at the time by getting a job in the workforce was probably around $8,000 a year. And I remember sitting down and saying, well, that's $8,000, that's a lot of money. With that, I could put that towards a house. Why would I do that? So honours wasn't on my list, and in those days, I never even knew about PhDs or travelling overseas to do postgrad courses. So it was a matter of just get out, get a job, and survive. And that probably came into me from my parents.
Now, Bill, post-university you apply for a graduate traineeship job at ANZ Bank. Tell us about that.
Well, there's actually a step before that. When I was at university, the most sought-after jobs that you could get in the marketplace were working with the public service, state and federal. And everyone wanted to join the public service because we were in the middle of a recession. We'd had a recession for 3 years. And the public service offered more money than the banks. And at that stage, the banks were struggling to get people to work in them because people didn't want to work in a bank. Why would you want to work in a bank? A bank had no future. Right? Well, join the public service, safe security, you can work your way up to all these exciting roles and become a professional administrator in the government. And I applied for jobs in both state and federal public service, and they rejected me. So I thought, what else do you do? So I applied to the bank and they accepted me. And so I joined the banking industry, and I often wonder if the public service had have accepted me, would I still be there? Because once I joined the banks and I had to start a banking career, well, you stayed in it. And so that was a very important part of my life, that decision alone, which again was influenced by a recession.
And what was the role that you were doing at ANZ Bank at the time?
I came in as a graduate trainee, which meant that, I went into the Sydney office and worked in a large bank, and you picked an area you worked in and you focused on it and you moved to another area. But I started off in lending, and it was a really good experience because, again, every day I was dealing with people that owed money. There were debt everywhere, and there were a lot of interesting people that were big clients. And I remember in the branch I was in at the time, Harry Triggerboff was a client, and Harry had a lot of financial problems. Harry came in one day, he was being heavied by the bank manager, and Harry came in with all the keys of all the apartments he was building and threw them all on the desk and said, "You fix it, you finish them." And they gave him some more money. And that was a long time ago, right? Yeah. But it was a different time, and I can still remember in the ANZ, the first bad loan that I was actually close to, that I recommended we should give some money to the guy, was for a priest. And he wanted small overdraft and all this. And so we did the overdraft submission and we sent in the money, and then he wanted a holiday overseas and never came back. So welcome to the world of lending, right? It's not what you think it is, it's not boring, it's colourful. But that was a good job, and that I learned a lot and went through all sorts of different businesses, and ultimately I was going really well. I was, being told all the time you're a star and you're top of your grade, and you'll get promoted and all this sort of thing. And then I wanted to go on holidays, and it's a long story, but I won a trip. Well, my fiance at the time won a trip. Worked on it jointly, and we wanted to travel to Europe. And the bank said, "You can go, but we can't give you any more than 1 month's holiday." I said, "Look, I really want 3 months." And they said, "Well, if you want 3 months, you'll have to leave." So I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll leave." So I did. And that's an important part of my life.
And tell us about the important step that you've missed there, the game show.
Well, it's really interesting again. My fiancée at the time, Denise, she was, in the bank, in that era, you were told when you could have your holidays. You couldn't pick when you wanted to go on holidays. And I was told, I was going on holidays for the month of August. And in Sydney, the month of August was terrible, it's cold, we had no money. We couldn't really even afford to go out anywhere. So we went and started to go through what can you do with your time for, in a month in Sydney that's cold where you're on holidays. It'd be like a lockdown. So we looked up the television studios and we went to see a television show being made. And we wanted to get into a lot of the really good shows that were being filmed, and they're all booked out. That's what people did in those days, go to watch television shows being filmed. And but we got on to Channel 10 and there was a new show called Keep Pace with Harriet. And we went along, we didn't know what we went for, and we got there and there was about 10 people in the audience. And they were all elderly, sitting around, and they had this quiz show. And what you had to do, you had to pick a country, and you come out on stage and they'd ask you 5 questions about your country, and you'd be against 3 people, and if you won, they had a little plane on the board and they'd fly your plane 20% around the world, and the first one back home won. And you got to go to the next round. And it was quite interesting. Anyhow, they wanted me to go down, and I actually wouldn't go down because I had to walk down about 10 stairs, and they're pretty steep. And I knew I didn't have the muscle strength to walk down the stairs, so I talked my girlfriend into going down the stage, and she didn't want to go. And anyhow, she went down there and she won, which is great. So they gave us a couple of prizes. We won one of those old big cardboard containers of rosé wine, and now a box of chocolates or something. Anyhow, we went home, and this show was on every day. And so the next day we watched the next one. And I knew that she had to go back for the next round because you would work your way through a series of rounds to the final. And I was sitting there and I'm thinking, there's a method in all this, because everyone that's getting on is picking the United States, UK, Ireland. And I said, this is really weird. Why don't people pick countries that no one knows about? So we planned it, and we got out all the encyclopedias, and I picked 5 countries that we would write down all the key facts about. And we did it. And so she'd spend the day on the floor and learning these facts. And anyhow, she got right through to the final. And the question in her category, she picked Bolivia. And the question was, what's the lake in Bolivia, Lake Titicaca? And bang, she won it. But it was quite interesting because up in the final, she was up against a couple of expert quiz people, and this was for a trip to Europe and holiday and all this sort of stuff, and she won it. And so that's how we decided to go on a trip. And obviously, actually the trip was to Paris and Yugoslavia. And I remember that well because we got on the plane, we flew Yugoslavian Airlines, JAT, and we got on the plane, and we're in the last row of the plane, and I looked up at the ceiling, and there's ceiling tape right across the cracks in the internal lighting of the plane. I thought, well, this is really interesting. And that's how our overseas journey started. And that was a whole new world.
And you mentioned in the book the importance of travel, particularly later in life. But what did you do on that 3 to 6 months that you were away? Where'd you go and what'd you learn?
Really interesting. I wanted to do things that people didn't do. So I was really interested in politics, and I was really interested in world change, and I wanted to go to Russia. So I wanted to go through all the communist countries, the USSR, and did a couple of trips, and did a couple of trips on really small little tour groups, and I'm very lucky. I went through just about every country in Europe and the USSR, and we drove right through the middle of the Soviet Union, from Leningrad right down to Kiev, which is now in the Ukraine, and then across the Black Sea and back up through all the Eastern Bloc countries. And it was a real eye-opener for me because, up till then I'd been told, the media had been telling us that, the Russians were going to conquer the world, and, they had one thing, and that was, their ambitions to come through Asia. And I got up there and I had a very different view on it because, you got in the middle of Moscow and there's no people. Shops had nothing in them. People were starving. The average person, outside the city lived in a tin shed with a cow and a pig, and you'd see the military, as you started to drive through in the country areas, and they'd be marching, and if you look closely, they'd have, different boots on and buttons missing on their uniforms, and some people wouldn't have hats, and if you look really closely, they were poor. They were really, really poor. And we sort of travelled right through Russia, and you'd stop at places to eat, and they'd lock you up if you were, wherever you were as a tourist, they'd lock you up into areas with big high fences around the outside with barbed wire around the outside. And the reality of that is they did that for your own safety because they didn't want the locals breaking in to steal what you had. And it was a different era. When we drove in on a bus, they'd pull the bus apart at the border. They'd go through every bit of clothing that everyone had. You'd be detained for 3 hours to cross the border. They'd strip every panel off the bus, take every tyre off. They were looking for black market things that would be sold internally, and which they never found because they were not smart enough, but which is another story. But the whole issue on that was that, you know, once you had a bus and you could drive, you could go through the country. But you could only drive a certain distance without having to report into an observation tower.
Wow.
So every day, you know, there was no driving from Sydney to Melbourne. You could drive so far and you had to put your plan in every day, and there'd be an observation tower. And if your car didn't go through the observation tower, they come looking for you. And we had some great experiences in that trip because, you know, we did go off the track we were supposed to, and you know, we went into a few little villages, and you know, we'd go for a walk, and the locals would come up, and the locals all thought we were Americans because everyone's American, and they were the enemies, and so we had people chasing us with hammers and axes, and you know, chasing us with wild dogs, and you'd scramble back on the bus and drive off, and it was a different world, you know, and you know, we were in Kiev, I think, I remember very clearly, and we were sitting on the street in the bus in a bit of sun, and we had the front door of the bus open, and this guy with one leg and an eye patch on his eye, you know, hobbled up to the front door and threw a big stone into the middle of the bus and hobbled off, and you know, it had a message on it. And it was in an envelope, and it was, can you please deliver this to such and such in Pittsburgh, USA? And of course, there's always an American on the bus. I said, yeah, I'll do that. So, but it was a different era, and but I left Russia coming out thinking this is an economic nightmare. Yeah. These people can't afford to feed themselves, let alone, you know, have a missile program or you know, a space program. And you know, it was a poor country, and you know, and I went home and I sort of, you know, I thought about, well, look, all the media on this has not been right. So, into the world of media, politics, economics, and social change. And of course, that was 1978, and you know, a bit over a decade later, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and really economics were a major part behind it. And I came out of that trip with a distinct view that this system would not survive in its current format. And probably at that time I couldn't quite work out how you benefit from that. But it was a real eye-opener for me, because later on I went through the same process in China, and it was gave me a different view on the media, government policy, and really just trying to, you know, drill down yourself into what's really going on, not what you read in the paper.
And I think you returned to Sydney around about at age 24, and you worked for a company called Beneficial Finance back then.
I basically, when I came back, I took the first job I could get, and I put an ad in to work for a finance company called Beneficial Finance, and I got a job there as a lending manager, and that was really interesting. In those days, in the 70s, the finance companies were the companies that you went to for your finance when the bank wouldn't give you finance. And they were actually very dominant in construction lending, real estate, leasing. And Beneficial Finance was one of the largest real estate lending finance companies in Australia. And that was a really interesting exercise, because I just worked my way up through that company very quickly. And one of the reasons I was successful in working my way up through that country was actually, I used to actually tell people, I had a view, and I'd tell people how the world was going to change. And in those early days, I had a view on, you know, the world, where it was going. And in those days, most people didn't have a view. And so I quite enjoyed that. And so I was very successful in that area, particularly in marketing. And I built that up, you know, very quickly. And I got promoted, and by about the age of 28, I was estate manager. And I had staff about 80 and I had a big office, and that was the era then, in that era that, you had your cocktail cabinet in your office, and if you come back from lunch before 3 o'clock, it'd be what went wrong. It was that era. And so I built that up, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot through that era of beneficial finance, because what happened to finance companies continually is they all went bankrupt every cycle. And we were very much in cycles. You had 7-year cycles, and 3 were good, 4 were bad, 2 years coming into it, would be good, and then it would crash, and it was all up and down. Yep. And developers would go bankrupt all the time, and some people had wealth, but 5 years later they never had it. And interest rates were very variable, and so finance companies collapsed. And so I was looking for something. I was quite comfortable. I was looking for something else. I wanted a bigger challenge. Yep. And at that stage, I was trying to work out, well, how do I knew I had muscular dystrophy. I got diagnosed. I knew I'd be in a wheelchair later day. And so I had to make a decision about, well, how do I fast track my career? And I thought, well, if I'm going to fast track my career, I've got to be able to do something I can do on a bigger scale, a global scale. And I've got to get into a system where I can actually share in the profits rather than, earn a wage.
In 1984, you get a call from a Phil Cave who worked at Hill Samuel. What did he call you about?
Well, he rang me out of the blue and he said, look, I've heard you've done a good job and you're pretty good. I want to offer you a job. And I want you to come work at Hill Samuel. And I said, well, we're happy to chat. So we arranged a time to have a chat. And he said to me right up front, look, this is what I'll pay you, and here's how it works. And he offered me a very important lesson. He offered me more than I was earning. And sorry, let me phrase that. At the time, he offered me less than what I was earning. And he said to me that we'll put you on a profit sharing scheme if you're successful, and if you earn money, you can share in the profits. And that will ultimately let you share in the equity of the business. And it was a really interesting decision for me because, I'd grown up with money is critical. And I had to make a decision between my career and backing yourself or really, deciding to stay where you are. And so I said yes. And then he sent me along to a series of interviews with the managing director and a couple of other key people in there. And I think my first meeting, I had David Clark, the chairman, and Tony Berg was the CEO. And at the time, and we met, we had a good chat, and we had a really good friendly chat, and I took the job. And so I joined Hill Samuel, and I think wasn't many people there at that stage. It might have been 20 or so, and maybe 30. And so I joined them, and that was a different experience again, because that was essentially an investment bank and merchant bank, investment bank, and they were professional, corporate advisors, and so I walked into an area and I had one staff, shared a secretary, I had one staff member, and I remember it really well. I had a loan book of $60,000, I think, on the book, loans outstanding, and no products. And our guidelines were that, we needed, sort of 3 times interest cover on a loan, and we could only lend up to 60%. And of course, the interest rates were very high, and so I had to recreate the whole business, the whole products, and I was able to do that. And it's a long story, but it was very, very successful.
And I think at the time you sort of re-engineered the whole model, and you were offering 100% finance of the development costs in exchange for 50% of the profits. Yeah,
we started that, and we got copied very quickly, but we started these long-term equity participation deals, and we were the sort of the first ones to go out there and say, well, look, we'll give you 100%, and but we want half the profit. And once everyone started doing it, well, suddenly people started doing it for 20% of the profit, and then ultimately they do it for 9% of the profit, and that's when they all went on. But we started that, and that was good, and that was, again, backing in judgment on transactions, and that's what I was all about, rather than just extrapolating the trend, picking up the cycles, getting inside what was going to happen, not what had happened, and picking winners. And a big part of that was social change, economic change, political change, and trying to understand what all that meant. And ultimately that led into international expansion.
What happened with Macquarie? How did that start? I understand that it started almost as an offshoot of Hill Samuel, but what happened there?
We can thank Paul Keating for that because, we had a very forward-thinking government there at that stage with Hawke and Keating, and basically the banking system was deregulated. And the theory with that was that, look, Australian banks are inefficient, they're not competitive. What will happen here is we'll open it up to international players, and we'll let the large international players come in the market, and it will force the local banks to adapt or to die. And so they did. And so they issued new banking licences, and Macquarie was, by coincidence at that time, Macquarie had been ahead of the game and had been working on converting Hill Samuel as an investment bank into a trading bank while this was happening. So we were ready to go, and we changed from Hill Samuel to Macquarie when this was announced. And so we were up and running as a bank, and there were a lot of advantages in having a bank, particularly with balance sheet management and credibility, and a lot of challenges with it too. But from that day on, Macquarie was really going down a path of being a different type of bank. We were heading more towards an investment bank with a banking licence. Yeah. And that's had a major influence over time with the involvement of the bank. It was a very important step, a very good calling card when you're trying to establish business internationally to be a bank. So it had an important part of our history.
And you've been there for a few years at that point, and then the stock market collapsed and crashed in the late 1980s. What was Macquarie's response to that, and I guess what was the impact on your role or on the bank?
Yeah, it was really interesting because we just listed our first listed property trust at that stage, and that was in 1987. And we bought a standalone building in Lonsdale Street, Melbourne, and that was the first asset, and it had more assets to go into it. Of course, we started with one asset and the others never came the short term because of the market collapse, right? But it was a really interesting exercise for me because it was so volatile, and in rough numbers, we had a trust that had a market share price of $1 a share, but the asset was being valued by the share market at $1.25 a share. And so this is pretty easy. And then in a matter of 3 weeks, the market crashed. And what happened then was that within 6 months, it had a real estate value of not $1, but had a real estate value of 90 cents, but the share price was 60 cents. So we went from a premium to a discount, and very quickly, wake up lesson on this is the real world, right? And so that was the start of an education program on listed trusts and what you could do, and learned a lot out of that. And basically what I learned out of that was that it was very hard for us in those days to start a funds management business because you couldn't borrow the capital, you couldn't borrow the debt. The share markets wouldn't give you money, because you didn't have a track record, and we were competing against the likes of AMP, GPT, Westfield, and we couldn't get capital, so we couldn't secure assets, and so we had to work a way out of actually creating new products that hadn't been in the market. And we set out and we came to market with what we called sector-specific trust, and we started specialising in regional shopping centres. We started specialising in neighbourhood shopping centres. We started specialising in industrial properties and creating sector-specific trusts. And my logic always was, well, look, we'll change the way it's done, because at the moment people buy units in the trust, and it's a general trust, and you get a bit of everything. And I said, well, that's not the way it should be in the future. People should be able to buy their own investments into what they've got. That makes sense?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it very well, but start again. My view is that people should be able to invest in the sectors they see have got growth, and stay out of the sectors they don't think have growth.
Yeah.
And that led to a series of new trusts, ultimately our leisure trust, and ultimately trust internationally, which we had listed trusts in Singapore, the US, and unlisted trusts right across the rest of the world. But we were always about innovation, doing something that hasn't been done, and trying to be a market leader. And it worked, because when people copied you knew you were a market leader, and it's great to be copied.
And I think during this time you also met two people, both in the real estate sector but in different capacities, that you forged strong relationships with: Charles Tarby of Century 21 and John Simmond of Aussie Home Loans. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, look, they actually came out of my days of beneficial, because when I was marketing finance and beneficial finance and mortgages, John was working in a legal office across the road, and John was processing mortgage applications and going to a bank and getting those processed and taking a commission as a broker. And Charles was the real estate agent, and he was up in the lower Blue Mountains, and Charles ran a lot of real estate agencies through the lower mountains, and a very professional guy. And he was involved in finance for people buying houses all the time. So there was a link here between mortgage finance and real estate agents and solicitors. And both of those people were very good friends of mine, and we built a relationship with. And when I was at Macquarie, I kept in touch with John, and in particular, and John and I, originally sat down and worked a structure up where Aussie Home Loans could operate. And John's idea, and John was brilliant, because John had travelled, he'd been to the States, he'd seen what had happened there, and saw an opportunity in the market. And John was a classic entrepreneur, and an educated and smart entrepreneur. And my role in that day one was to provide the securisation through Macquarie to help this get off the ground. And originally we had a joint venture into that, and then ultimately, that lasted for many, many years. But ultimately, as Aussie Home Loans grew, they had more funders, and we took on more clients with securitisation. So we went our own ways, but really good example, and John was a great pioneer of this industry. And John had one thing that I admired. John was always at the grassroots. He would talk to the clients. He'd talk to people. He'd understand the problems, and he had a better idea where the economy is going with housing than anyone else. He wasn't in an ivory tower. He was on the ground, and he was able to very, very quickly pick up where markets are going, while commentators in the banking system, the economics departments, and we're so far off the game in many cases. So John was very important in that game. And and that's a story there. And Macquarie ended up taking a shareholding in Aussie Home Loans, and ultimately that was very successful.
So it's the 1980s, finance is relatively easy to come by, and Macquarie has a blacklist of people that under no circumstances would you lend to. Tell us about that.
Oh, I'm not sure I really want to tell you about the blacklist. Look, there are always people that Macquarie said, we think you really don't want to be involved with, and Macquarie was always, it was a very ethical company in the context of, we didn't want to deal with certain people that had bad reputations or people that, we thought had made their money, under conditions that could be challenged in the future, etc., etc. And, there were a number of those, and, there were rare exceptions when, the bank would deal with some of those people, but there were quite a few people on that list.
I can say it publicly because it's in the book. One of those, I believe, was Alan Bond. Yeah. Tell us about your 60-second meeting in an elevator with Alan Bond.
Well, that was really interesting because that would have been about 1987, I think, probably. It was when he built the Chifley Tower in Sydney. And we were looking for a new building to relocate into, and of course we looked at that building. It was a beautiful building, it was over-capitalised, and it was a great design, and it still is. And I went to meet his son, and we talked about the deal, and we couldn't cut a deal as the bottom day because they wanted us to come into a building and take a corporate guarantee from Bond Corporation that, that if, they'd guarantee to pay a rental holiday in the future, blah, blah. And I would not accept it, the bank wouldn't accept it in their credit department because we didn't like the balance sheet of Bond Corporation. It was too risky. And so I went to the meeting and we couldn't agree, but we sort of left, and I got in the lift, and coincidence or planning, I don't know, but I'm in there for a pretty important meeting, and the lift stops on the floor that I'm on, and there's Alan Bond in the lift, no one else, and we had our discussion down into the foyer, and it was really interesting. And in the space of a lift, he asked me about everything, where interest rates are going, where the markets are going, what's happening with real estate, what's happening, my 20 questions in 30 seconds, and he stood in the foyer and for probably another minute or so, and asked me more questions, and then he left. And I thought, you could think a lot of things of that discussion. I thought, well, that's a perfect way of actually getting a grassroots view on where you think things are going. You talk to people in lifts. You talk to people in foyers. And again, John Simons, knowing where the markets are going. So anyhow, that was my introduction to Alan, and of course, that all went belly up for him after the market collapsed, and it's an interesting story. But there were a number of people like that.
And you're well known for being able to forecast market peaks and troughs in economic cycles. And in 1989, I think a year before the 1990 crash of real estate values, you did just that, reducing Macquarie's real estate exposure, particularly in Melbourne. What did you see then that others didn't?
We planned for that. After the share market collapsed in 87, no one knew what to do. I can remember long days and days of sitting in boardrooms with people brainstorming, wasn't me, just like COVID-19. And we'd come out of that with a strategy, and the strategy very much was, well, let's go and look what's happened elsewhere in the world when you've had major economic downturns. And I remember at the time we had a lot of data out of Hong Kong, and we looked at we looked at what could happen with various changes to interest rates and unemployment. And our view was that real estate values could drop 50%, and that could go on for maybe 4 years before we turned around. And so we then had to set a strategy of, well, if that's the case, we want to get out all the construction projects we've got and all the development joint ventures we've got, and we only want to focus on blue chip lending on blue chip assets, the blue chip guaranteed sources. And so that's what we did, and we planned it. And I remember really well because we only had 12 or 14 people at that stage in real estate, and most people couldn't believe what we're talking about. Like, you're mad, it's not going to happen. Right? And so we planned it and we did all that. We got out of basically all our construction facilities and that. And we started to move into this blue chip investment grade property. And we focused on Melbourne for that because Melbourne had a much higher net worth base down there, and they had a better track record in asset values, but, staying solid in certain locations, particularly Collins Street. And so we started doing those loans, and we started doing 60% gear loans when the market was a bit tight with personal guarantees for people. And, we wanted an interest cover, 1.5 times. And we'd take a 5-year view on it, and we'd want a success fee based on capital appreciation 5 years out. We had quite a lot of these, and it was really interesting because when the tidal wave came, there's always a time lag here. You know what? We were right, but we were wrong. Because what happened in Melbourne was quite severe, as you're aware now, and the wealthy people that we'd taken loans off went bankrupt. Tenants that were blue chip tenants no longer existed. And so with lack of rentals coming in, lack of guarantees, property prices dropping, suddenly in many cases you're behind water. And it was, in some of those cases in Melbourne, the assets fell 60%. And it all gets forgotten, 20 years later, but, there are big shocks when things go wrong. And Melbourne just happened to have a once-in-a-lifetime correction in real estate. And we went through that, we stayed there, we had to adapt. And I keep saying adapt or die. You adapt or you die. And I remember Melbourne sitting around thinking, what do we do? So we did the first inner-city residential apartment complex in Melbourne. And we converted an old office building. And we did that, and everyone said it wouldn't work, and it worked. Everyone bought that, and that was on the basis of, people would come back to the cities to live, being residential in the cities. We did the first university housing project in Melbourne with Lang Walker, and that was a follow-up with the first one in Sydney as well, with a guy called Frank Carmichael and Lang Walker. We bought into it opposite Sydney Uni. So we're always out there, we're looking at new concepts and new way forwards in all of this, and it was a really interesting time. And one of my fondest memories with Jeff Kennan. I'd never met Jeff, right? And we had a client at the time that wanted to open up a lot of, retail properties that would compete with Woolies and Coles. And there was a company called Flemings, you probably forget Flemings, and they wanted to come to Melbourne, and we were working with them, and they were now owned by a Hong Kong entity, and they wanted to come in and compete with Woolies and Coles. And they said, well, we can't get sites, can you help us get sites? So I arranged to have a meeting with Jeff Kennett. I remember really well, I went down with Jeff Kennett and sat down with Jeff, and he had one person with him. He said, what do you want? I said, I want to do this. What do you want to do it for? I want to create jobs. Good. What do you need? Cool. Okay, we can do that, we can do that, we can do that. Turned to the guy next to him and said, can you fix that up? And he did. Wow. Right? And, Jeff's a great guy, and I got to know Jeff a little bit afterwards, and great thinker, right? And, Jeff is I heard him speak last year at a conference, and he was having a go at the New South Wales government. He was saying, look, you don't need it, because they were all in the room listening to him speak, the Premier and the various ministers, and he said, you don't need ministers. He said, the lesson I learned is you run a state with 3 people. You run it with yourself, your secretary and your driver. And that's all you need, and it'll be more efficient. And I thought, if I could tell that story about you, that's exactly what you did.
Yeah.
And you turned the state around pretty much on his own. Cut out the bureaucracy and you grow.
So, early to mid-1990s, under the leadership of Tony Berg and with yourself as the Executive Director of Macquarie, the team flourished, the amount of divisions grew, there was real estate agency, real estate advisory, property syndications. Tell us about this growth of the bank in the 90s.
Look, we had a philosophy that we want to grow, but there was a lot of caution in that, because Tony Berg was an incredible guy, and probably one of the smartest people I've ever met in a business sense. But he was ultra cautious, ultra cautious. And I would go in with a property transaction. The managing director had to sign off on every lending deal we did with construction. And I'd go in and I'd spend 2 or 3 hours of a night from 7 till 9 or something talking to Tony about the deal. And he'd argue every word in every submission, and it was great. And I'd never let him win an argument. I'd always have an answer for him, and that's what I learned. Now, I still remember in 1989 talking to Tony about a property deal we wanted to do, and he started to talk about negative land values. He said, have you ever seen negative land values? I said, no. He said, have you ever been to New York and looked at what's happening over there? I said, no. And he said, he picked up the phone and he rang his friend who he'd been, he rang up his friend who he knew from doing an MBA with him many years ago, who was running Goldman Sachs. And he said, I've got a guy with me, Bill Moss, I want to send him over for 3 months to work with you, and I want you to teach him all about real estate. And they had a chat. I said, Tony, look, Tony, I got a 3-year-old son, I got one 18-month-old daughter, blah, 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 He said, take him with you. So we did. And I went and lived in New York and worked for Goldman Sachs for a while and learned so much. But the thing I did learn that Tony wanted me to learn was about negative real estate values. In that era in New York, the city was so poor that there were empty blocks in suburbs of residential buildings that were burnt out, empty, graffiti all over them. And it basically happened because people could not afford to own real estate because the city had put the rates and taxes up so high that people had simply given the keys back to the city. And it was a mess. It was an economic mess, And we drove for hours and hours around Brooklyn, the Bronx, and down to Harlem. It was deserted, empty. It was a nightmare. And the reality was negative real estate values. It cost you more to keep a site than what you could get in rental. And that's what Tony was talking about. Severe economic downturn, the sort of thing that happens when the economy breaks down, the systems break down, supply chains break down, and you get into not anarchy, because you've got control with, the military for one, military, police, you've got control, but there are no jobs. And so I learned a lot about that, and 1989 was a bit of a watershed for me, and I came back and I looked at what Goldman Sachs were doing. I said, well, we're doing all that anyhow. There wasn't much there that wasn't on my agenda anyhow. And so we came back and I did learn a lot about negative land values, and it gave me a view on real estate. I've always been a very tough person for credit risk in trying to understand not only the upside, but the downside. And it sort of brought together my whole view on global risk, for me, it's not only, you can't isolate real estate, it's social change, it's political change, it's economic change. And they all come together in a formula that determines what happens with real estate. And, coming out of every recession I've been through, at the end of the day, you get social change. You get political change. And the only thing that, can't run away in an economic downturn is real estate. You can't move real estate offshore. So when governments are looking at taxes, the one thing they can always get to and they can always tax is real estate. And that's what they do.
And one infamous Macquarie model at the time was the tight and loose method. What was that?
It's a good model. It was actually, it's been there ever since I was there. It's about tight credit, put really tough, mean people in credit that are going to, really try and, be as negative as anything. But you want entrepreneurs. And when Alan Moss came in as the chairman, Alan's an absolutely incredible person too, highly intellectual, different to Tony Berg. And I'd worked with Alan before in Macquarie when he was running Treasury. And he, really good guy. And we're talking about my business, and Alan's got a certain style about him. It's a beautiful style. He doesn't confront. He sort of floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee, Alan. He's a very good guy. And he said to me, look, let me give you some advice. He said, don't employ people with MBAs. Don't employ accountants. Employ entrepreneurs. If you want to follow your dream and grow globally, and you want to build new relationships globally, you need entrepreneurs. And I went down that track, and it was correct, And so we were very different in our strategy for growing globally because we were able to, float like a butterfly in many ways. And when we saw the deal that was all right there, we'd sting, we'd go for it.
One of the other theories at this time was the boiling frog theory. Tell us about that.
Again, great lesson from Tony Berg. And Tony got into a lot of trouble over this because Tony thought that, the world should know about the boiling frog. And boiling frog is very simple. You can put a frog into a pot, cold water, and it will just sit there. If you slowly turn the heat up under the pan, the frog will actually sit there and die. Right? If you put a frog into boiling hot water, it will jump out straight away. And the whole boiling frog theory really is that if you adapt to your conditions around you and you can't see what's actually coming. So you've got to be aware of what's happening around you. But if you just extrapolate the trend all the time, ultimately you'll die. And in those days you had property developers who just keep building residential housing, same model, boom, boom, boom. They get bigger and bigger and bigger. And ultimately they go bankrupt. Because they couldn't see what was happening economically, politically, socially. And those factors had amazing impacts on the real estate industry in Australia since I've been involved in it. And we were able to see that. I mean, we were watching the change in household formation. We were watching, the divorce rate going up. We were watching, children moving out of home. We're watching the creation of the gay community and all the effects that had on the size of dwellings, the demand for dwellings, smaller apartments, watching the boom in education, global education. And all those things were really good because if you get it on the ground floor and you get in the right sector at the right time, you can make good profits. You just extrapolate the trend, you're in the crowd.
And I think also during this period, late 90s, mid to late 90s, the business under your leadership and with Tony Berg and Alan Moss expanded into Asia. Tell us about the expansion, why Asia?
Well, I knew that, you know, coming back from my days in Russia, I knew that what would happen, or what was happening at that time after, you know, the Soviet Union collapsed and, you know, the whole Eastern Bloc countries were, you know, reorganising themselves, and massive social disruption, massive costs going on. But we knew that there'd be massive economic growth happening longer term. And I wanted to pick one country in the world that we could go to, we could settle down and say this is a major country that's going to have an impact on Australia in the future, and what we do, how we live, everything from social, economic, political. And I drew a map of the world on a whiteboard one day, and I had China and India. And I said, well, look, we've got to pick one of these. And we went through the whole thing, and for a lot of reasons, we picked China. And it was the right call, because ultimately, you know, it's been very hard to do a deal in India. It was the right call. And so I went out and I employed the right number of people that had the expertise, and we started looking at, you know, well, you know, what does all that mean? And prior to that, we'd been in Hong Kong. We'd been looking at taking Australian deals to Hong Kong. And so I did quite a lengthy paper on why we should go to China. And it was a really interesting scenario, because for me, I had a very clear picture of where China would be in 10 and 20 years. Right? And I saw China having, you know, a quarter of the world's population, you know, having ultimately a quarter of the world's GDP, and ultimately a quarter of the world's tourists, and ultimately a quarter of the world's military strength, and a quarter of everything, right?
Yeah.
And you can't stop it ultimately, right? The question is, how long would it take? And so I went to China, and we had contacts over there, and we started talking to the government. And you know, I've always found if you go and talk to a government, the national government, it's a lot easier than you think. And I'd done it before in Indonesia, and I'd done it in Hong Kong, and China was an interesting situation for me, because I knew what we wanted to do. I had a plan. I had enthusiastic people around me that, you know, I had employed, and I employed some very, very good people to do this. And I went to the board, and the paper went up to the executive committee, and you know, we went through the executive committee, then it goes from the executive committee to the board meeting. And I got invited to the board to talk to the directors, and we had one of the most eminent boards you could have in business at that stage. And I gave my vision, and I was horrified that most people around the table said it won't work. And the comments were along the line, they're communists. It'll never work. You know, they'll steal your technology. They will, you know, you can't trust them. You know, they don't have a future. They're always going to be communists. And I'd been arguing about, well, they're changing their system. You've now got mortgages. They're opening up the housing system. They're encouraging people to take mortgages, and you know, blah blah blah. Anyhow, I got it through, but only just. And at the end of the day, it was people's belief in me that I knew what I was doing. Got this through. So we started, and it was an incredible journey, because, you know, when I first went to China around that era, I mean, I remember really well going into Shanghai, flying into Shanghai. And it took 3 hours to drive from the airport to the Mun. And you were lucky if you saw 4 or 5 cars on the way. It was full of bicycles and carts and little trucks with one wheel at the front, and big crowded buses, and this was China, right? And I had to work a strategy out on how do I do China, and I did. That's where Paul Keating came in, and was very valuable in that, and that's where, you know, I was able to go and talk to, you know, government officials, you know, right through to Zhongji, and go in at a very senior level and say, we're Macquarie Bank, this is what we want to do, and this is how we do it. And we created a lot of new products there. And, you know, we took our products that we had in Sydney, that were working, and we were the first ones in China to actually bring foreign capital into China for residential real estate development and get the money out. And a really interesting way through a trust structure, and they had great returns. And in the early days until they had their Asian crisis. And even in China, you could see with an Asian crisis that the economy was suffering. It really suffered. But China was a unique story because I watched it grow. I met the people, and I never lost track of the lessons I'd learned, that you always talk to the people. You always go down and talk to the people on the street, and you understand their views on the world, and that's a very important part of it. And through that I got to learn their view on the history of China, and why Taiwan's an important part of China, and why the lands that they lost to the Europeans, the Russians, and the Americans, when they were invaded, are still regarded as part of China. And I can understand the disputes on the islands. I can understand, what went on in the Korean Peninsula, and right across the, Vladivostok and down through Vietnam. I get it from their perspective, right? And there's always two sides to every story. And again, there's a media side and a political side, but there are two sides. And so I always had a soft spot for China, and I still do. And it was an amazing journey for me because it was very successful. The bank's still in China, Macquarie's group's still there. And, we've got a good reputation, and, we were able to do a lot of things in China because Macquarie had a great reputation, and we're Australian. And Americans were disliked because they were Americans. They were seen as the enemy. We were Australians. We were not the enemy. And when I brought Paul Keating in after he left politics to do some consulting work for me, there was a reason for that. And Zhurongji was the premier in China, and he was the first premier that really opened it up and brought it into the world. Still highly regarded, highly intelligent guy. And, Paul, when he was treasurer and Zhurongji was the mayor of Beijing, Paul gave Zhurongji the money to start the redevelopment of Shanghai into a modern city. And Paul gave him the number one priority for the government at that stage in the rebuilding of Shanghai. Step number one, build a sewage plant that worked. And that money came from Australia. And everywhere I went, the Australian reputation through the Chinese government was wonderful. We were highly regarded. And Paul was amazing because Paul was able to get me into doors that I could never have got into. And we had a private meeting with Zhurongji that he organised, and it was a really delicate period in the politics between China and the rest of the world, because it was when the Chinese embassy in what was Yugoslavia had just been bombed by the Americans. And he was on a tour overseas, and we had a meeting set up, and Paul, we were dealing with the Australian embassy, and the Australian embassy had contacted us and said, look, the meeting's off because Zhurongji's not in town. Won't happen. And then Paul said, no, he'll be here. It'll happen. And then the night before, they said the meeting's not going to happen, the government, and Paul said, it's happening, be ready at 10 o'clock. So anyhow, 10 o'clock comes and we're ready, and we get in the cars and we go and see Zhurongji. No Australian government officials. Paul Keating, me, Paul's offsider, and we went to the meeting. We had a 2-hour meeting with Zhurongji in a beautiful private setting. We went to the meeting, and after the formalities, Zhurongji spoke perfect English. Paul started, talking about old times, he started telling China what their strategy should be globally, and they started talking about the next steps, on the world opening up and accepting China. And with this incredible story, and then next minute they're talking about, the trade issues with the US, what's going on politically. I felt like I was in the intersanctum of what's going on in the world today. And most incredible part of that, and we did a lot of work in China. The Zhurongji meeting was an incredible meeting. And I used the meeting with Zhurongji after that, here I went in China, to let people know I'd met Zhurongji and the doors would open. And that's how we did a lot of the work in China.
So fast forward to the 2000s, what sort of projects is Macquarie doing then? And talk to us about the growth of the team. I mean, by this time it must have had many hundreds of staff just in the real estate division.
Yeah, we'd grown pretty quickly, and I'd taken over the banking business there, and so we had a lot of staff, and we had offices in 25 countries or so, and branches all over the world really. We'd bought into other organisations that were funds management, and I think we had about $50 billion of real estate under our control or influence at one stage. And we were very successful. We had a very good funds management business, but we were also still innovative in looking at leisure products. We created the first listed leisure trust that invest into theme parks and boating facilities and bowling alleys, and we were into leisure with art and leisure. We were active in a lot of different ways. We were in childcare, we were still in securitisation, we were in banking, we were doing development finance, REITs, we were doing advisory. We played a role in taking our initial funds management structure and putting it into infrastructure with our corporate finance business. And we were across a lot of things, and it was a growing business, but it was a business that I really enjoyed, and my job was really spending a lot of time travelling, as you do when you've got a global business. And that's interesting, but it's hard.
And I think just before the 2002-2003 NBL season, the Sydney Kings went into administration. You formed a syndicate to buy them and see what you could do off the field to try and resurrect the team. Tell us about that.
Well, we had another director in the bank called Paul Robertson, and Paul used to run Treasury. Paul's a very good guy, and he recently retired as the chairman of St Vincent's. St Vincent's Hospital Group, and he was a passionate basketball fan, and we'd been involved with the Kings on and off in different capacities. And he came and said, "Look, let's put some money in and buy this." And so, as you do when you're looking for something interesting to do, we bought the team, and that was a really interesting exercise because we bought a team that had never won a title, and thanks to Paul. In particular, I think Macquarie Macquarie directors owned about 60% of it or something, and we within a very short period of time we recruited Brian Goorjian, and Brian was regarded as the best coach that there was at the time, and he was national coach, and anyhow we got Brian, and Brian put a team together, and we won the title that year for the first time ever, and we won the next 3 in a row. So we went from never winning a title to winning a title in the first 3 years. Yeah. And the reality is we should have had a 4th, but we still believe we got cheated in the final against the Melbourne Tigers. But anyhow, it's another story.
And how important was that, I mean, just to take your mind off work and just have something else to sort of look forward to and concentrate on and go to the matches as well? Was that one of the reasons, or was it more just an opportune?
Look, I used it for a lot of things. I used it for marketing into the bank. We had a lot of people that were clients that liked basketball. I used it for marketing. I also used it for personal enjoyment. But it was it was good because it was a relief. And I suppose I've always liked building business from nothing and, I'll always support the underdog and hope they win, right? And here was a case of it's on its knees, deserves better than this, what can you do? How do we bring it back? And I suppose, the most enjoyable moments of my life, there's a few, but, standing in the middle of the Sydney Entertainment Centre with 10,000 fans screaming when you win the title and you think, well, geez, look what we've done. It's pretty amazing.
And back to work, so we'll touch upon your retirement in March of 2007, but in the years leading up to the GFC, again, given your previous experience forecasting and being able to pick economic cycles, could you see anything wrong there or anything that looked out of place?
Look, I had a view before that. My view was that 2008 was always going to be the economic crunch coming. And there were plenty of people writing about that anyhow. There was a very good guy at the time called Harry Dent, who wrote several books on it. And Harry's an interesting guy. And I actually followed a lot of his books and really read them and understood it because it was all about ageing populations, changing consumer patterns and cycles. And I've always been a great believer in cycles, particularly in economies, but also real estate. 60-year cycle, 30-year cycle, 7-year cycles. I'd read the books that he'd written earlier that were very accurate, okay? And, he said 2008, and I looked at it and I thought, well, I think that's pretty right. And so, I'd seen what was happening in the US with the collapse of the mortgage market, and the day that I resigned was the first collapse of the savings banks loan in the US. And that's the day I formally left the bank. And there's a great chart I've got of the day I announced my retirement publicly and the collapse of the Macquarie Bank share price. I thought, wow, look at this, but no, it was the savings bank loan collapse, right? Nothing to do with Bill Moss. So it's a great chart. I wanted to get on and do other things, and my health was a major issue because during 2005 I got to the point where my health was deteriorating. I was travelling. I got to a point where I couldn't get out of a plane seat. Couldn't get off a toilet in a plane. And I was sitting in a boardroom in the city in Macquarie and about 2005, probably around mid to the end of that. And the board meeting was over, everyone left, and I couldn't get out of my chair. And I thought, no, this is it. Cut it now, get new people in that can have a different view, and that's what happened, essentially. So I left, and at that point I was more interested in my health, looking at medical research, setting up my foundation that I'd started to set up, and really looking at putting some time back into the disease that had changed my life and trying to win a battle against that rather than just going on doing more and more of the same. That was my aim at that point in time.
You mentioned in the book you left with no contacts, no database, no business cards. What did you do in the following months straight after that?
Well, I probably did the wrong thing in retrospect because the money I had ready to invest, I gave to a professional investor to go and invest it. And I went on a couple of holidays around the world, and I started to try and start to research the disease and what was happening. And I was sort of not tuned in every day to what's happening in the collapse of the economic system. And I should have been, because it was a very important part of the cycle. I should have concentrate on that, because if you can't have investments by remote control. You've got to be on top of what's really happening. And by the time I came back and I had my mind on it, I had to start working back, try and work out, well, what are the growth sectors, how do you recover, and I've done that very well.
And reflecting on your time at Macquarie, either now or, say late 2007, what were some of your proudest achievements or proudest periods at the bank?
Oh, look, there were a lot. I mean, I think probably creating so many businesses and being a catalyst for starting new business and, probably the people, really. I'm a team, we developed an incredible group of people that were highly, highly professional. And, when the GFC came, I didn't realise so much at the time, but a few years ago I realised we had a reunion, and basically the people that worked for me that were in the system, I say that, they weren't people I dealt with every day, but they were people that were there and they were part of the culture. They'd all gone on to great careers in real estate, playing some very dominant real estate positions. They'd gone on to and top companies. You'll find Macquarie people right through all the top businesses. And I had so many people come up to me and say, look, I want to thank you. I say, for what? They'd say, well, without you, I wouldn't have got the job where I am now because I worked at Macquarie. And working at Macquarie Real Estate was a stamp of approval. You had to be good to work there. So if you walked down to Macquarie and you got another job and you had that on your resume, you had a very good chance of being successful. And so, a lot of people, I think I changed people's careers too. A lot of people I met, I took quite a few people, from Australia and put them in China when they didn't want to go. And I, explained to them that, this is the best thing for your career. And some of those are still there today, 25 years later.
Wow.
Very successful, very wealthy, wouldn't leave. Best thing we've ever done, changed their life. And, I think that, having an effect on people's lives is probably one of the greatest things you can do. Forget the profit, forget the money, but changing people's careers is probably the number one thing I think I take out of my time at Macquarie.
And over your extraordinary career, you met hundreds of different people in different fields, including celebrities, high-profile business people, and that sort of thing. Out of all the people you met, whether it was Kerry Packer or John Simmond or any of those sort of guys, who had the biggest influence or impact on you?
Well, there's quite a few. I learned, if we talk people, well-known people, Richard Branson was really interesting because we set up Virgin Money in Australia, and I was the chairman of that when I was at the bank, and I got to know Richard pretty well. I found Richard a really interesting guy, and his model of operating was brilliant, and it was around marketing. You're the face, you're creative. Marketing and creativity and brand, you put those three things together and you'll always find investors who want to put the money in and you get a free carried share of the profit. And that's the Richard Branson story. And he only employed the best people. He would employ the best investment bankers and he would employ the best people. Really, really good guy, right? And a long time since I met Richard, a lot of people, praise him and a lot of critical of him, but a really intellectual guy in his own right. Right? And so I think he was very inspirational to me in all the things I've done. And I think, Greg Norman in his own way was very influential to me because we had a partnership with Greg for a long time, and we did a lot of golf courses around the world, and Greg was a very quiet guy, but Greg understood brand. His whole business was about brand. You create a product, you create the brand, you charge a premium for the brand, you market it as a premium, and ultimately, people will come in and they'll put the equity in to fund what you want to do, and you collect the premiums around the brand. And he had a very successful model, and Greg's products were great. Like Greg's design on houses were world class. His golf courses were not what you think; they were sensational. But Greg was into everything. Greg would make his own. He had companies that made his own grasses, and he'd have he grow buffalo that only lived on salt water, and all these different things, in a different world. Everything in detail that gets your brand, own your patents all the way through, and control it. And so, and Greg's a marketer. So I suppose I like the marketers. I really did. I like people that can, have got good ideas, lateral thinkers, people that, can articulate something, have got a view on where the world's going and what it's going to need. And I think those two were in that category pretty well. But, I met a lot of others too. A lot of others around the world that, were pretty important as well. Real colourful characters.
It seems to me like you've got two main projects that keep you busy at the moment and divide your time. One is the FSHD Global Research Foundation, and then the other is your business interests, which are held within the Boston Global group of companies. Tell us about the FSHD Research Foundation first of all. What are your aims there, and why did you set it up?
The foundation was originally set up to find a cure for FSHD. Complex, very complex. And it was always going to morph into a cure for all muscle diseases and muscle wellness, which included, the ageing problems. But it needed a focus, and the focus was FSHD, because you don't only want to cure a disease, you want to then unwind all the damage that's been done. And that's a very important part of this that researchers forget. So it was set up to do that. It's done an incredible job. And again, I've used a lot of what I've learned in business through the foundation. I've created an image for it. We've won awards everywhere. We've set up partnerships with the best people in the world for science. We've set up a very successful model for a foundation that is single focused on one cure, one disease. We've changed people's views around the world. One of the great things about the foundation is that we've inspired another 10 or so foundations around the world to establish and set up. And we're a model. We're just not a foundation, we're a model for how you fight this. But the foundation is one of probably about 3 building blocks in what I call stable and muscle wellness. I've had 3 biotechs that I've funded in jointly or myself over the years. 2 are still operational, and there's another one in the health area that's working, but health food area that's working. But I believe you can't just be one-dimensional in finding a cure. You've got to attack this from a lot of different angles. And, we decided about 4 years ago, 4 years ago is when I decided to get more active again. You'll hear that a lot. But we decided about 4 years ago that we wanted to set up the world's first biotech that would have that we would control, would be run by people that have the disease. We'd take the world's best science that we understood. We'd employ our own drug discovery people, the best in the world, and we would bring a product to market without getting sidetracked on other diseases, other products, etc., etc. And we established that in the Netherlands with a good friend of mine in the Netherlands, and Kees van der Graffen, and we established it, and we, from that point on, it grew very quickly. And surprise, surprise, we created a model. It's a brilliant model because we were able to put a board together of very eminent people that have the disease in their family. And we could find people that were very wealthy, people that were chairmen of top companies in the US and Europe, senior people in business, senior scientists, and a very impressive board. We were able to get the best advisors in the world to work on this, and we were able to set the strategy ourselves. And it's been exceptionally successful in where it's going. And it's very close to getting into clinical trials. And we know now we can turn off the toxic protein that causes this disease. We know we can do that. Having said that, that's one part of it. because no biotech provides one tablet that fixes you. There are side effects, upstream, downstream effects, and the holy grail to me has always been regrowing tissue that you can no longer use. And that's what I'm working on through my next biotech, which is based in Sydney. And we've got a lot of new science and technology we're working on that I'm hoping that if it all comes to fruition, and if it doesn't, we lose money, but we'll be able to look at a wide range of diseases. They've got fibrotic tissue, dead tissue, that we can show how to turn into healthy muscle. Now, if we can do that, that's the holy grail of a lot of things, particularly the ageing diseases that happen. So we're working on that. My history's always been, my hobbies, I suppose, have always been medical research across cancer, muscles in particular, and about, really the human body and how the genome is affected by everything we do in our daily lives, and understanding the DNA. And I spent a lot of time on the DNA, understanding that. And so we know a lot about it, and the foundation has been great. It's been a central part of this. And I'm very pleased to say we're still this foundation. No one's been able to achieve what we've achieved. 100% of all tax-deductible donations go into medical research from day one.
So Bill, I want to finish with a couple of quick questions for you in regards to lessons that you've learnt along the way, and those lessons that you can share with our audience. So I want to know, what was the impact of bullying that you received during your childhood, and how much did it drive you later in life?
Probably at the time I didn't realise the effects, but bullying's been around forever, and I was a young kid that walked with a limp, and you look different when you rode a bike and you couldn't tackle or catch a cricket ball. So you get bullying, right? I was probably lucky in many ways. At least I was big, I wasn't small. And it looked like I had muscle even though I didn't. So I think I was a bit lucky in that, but it does have an effect on you. It does have a big effect, and I think we're all just starting to understand the effect that mental stress has on people, their performance and that in life. And so it does have an effect. And I've got lots of areas in health I'd love to be in, but where we're going, one of the areas we're going into through Boston Global is we're looking at new technologies and around mental health.
And the other one I want to know is how important is having confidence in your ability? You mentioned in the book very early on you learnt that lesson, the need to have confidence in your own ability, and you obviously displayed that throughout your career. How important is that, do you think?
Really critical. Without self-esteem, you won't do much at all. For me it's always got to be believe you can do it, and that's easy to say. But there's a process to go through to actually get where you want to go, because you need to educate yourself on what you're talking about. You need to do your research, and then the third part of it is you need to come up with your solutions. And because if you simply have a view from reading social media and you come up with a solution, it doesn't work. You can't jump that step. You've got to be able to consider both sides, of the debate. In fact, you've got to be your own judge. You've got to judge this evidence and that evidence, and you've got to question, particularly today with the amount of fake news around. You've got to question everything. And my father said to me when I was a young boy, he said, one of the few things I remember, he said, look, whatever you do in life, don't believe anything you read in the newspaper. Only the date at the top, and every now and then just check that as well.
I want to know, you mentioned as well, both publicly and in the book, the importance of personal relationships when getting into business. How important is that you really getting to know a person?
Well, again, you're a team. Whether you like it or not, you're a team. Right? It might be a team of two, but you're a team. Same in marriage, you're a team. Right? You either get on or you don't. Right? And if you don't get on, there's usually a reason. And the reason you don't usually get on is you don't communicate. So you got to be able to communicate with people, and if you communicate with people, you'll get on with people. It seems to follow that if you talk to people, you'll find the things that you've got in common with them, and then you'll want to actually, have a relationship with someone. So communication is very important. I had a golden rule all the time when I was younger. If anyone wanted to talk to me about anything, I always had 15 minutes for a cup of coffee. Coffee probably wasn't good for me, but I always had time to listen. Because again, listening, you learn. I'd see lots of people that had crazy deals and all that, but every now and then, when someone would come in to see me and I'd give them 15 minutes and have the best deal, best idea I've ever heard of, and we'd do it jointly, and it'd be very successful and make a lot of money. Whereas a lot of people in my division wouldn't have even wasted 15 minutes of their life to talk to that person. But there are people you've got to talk to, and you've got to get to the grassroots. The day you lose track of the grassroots is the day you got very, very insecure foundations. That's politically, socially and economically.
I'll get killed if I don't ask this question, so I'll ask you it now. How long do you think it will take for real estate markets to recover, given the current crisis? And second to that, what's your thoughts on the stamp duty versus land tax debate?
Oh, good question. Look, let me just answer that in a number of ways. Number one, we are going to have a recession. Regardless of that, people are going to lose their jobs, productivity is going to drop, and it's going to take a long time to get back to where we were. Normally in a downturn, you're looking at 3 to 4 years for markets to come back, right? This time around it's a bit different because interest rates are so low, right? But interest rates are only beneficial in the scheme if the banks are lending. And the big issue here for the banks is, what are banks going to lose on small business loans? Because normally when the banks get into difficulty on any of their loans, they cut off loans elsewhere, right? So it's really about the banks having the liquidity to put the money into the market. Would I buy a house at the moment, an apartment? No, I wouldn't. Would I buy one in the future? Yes, I would. If I saw something that I thought was, once in a lifetime opportunity to buy it, would I buy it? Yes, I would. And I think in that statement, it's all about, markets within markets, and that's the beauty of the cycle we're in now. There'll be markets within markets. If you've got the ability to buy real estate with equity and not worry about an internal rate of return, long term you will win. Right? You will win. You'll win if you buy in the next 2 years or 3 years. Short term, it's a different scenario. If you've got buildings that don't have tenants and you don't understand what's going to happen to the change in retail spending, you don't understand what's going to happen to the change in office usage, and you've got no equity in it, good luck. It may be a long time.
And land tax v stamp duty?
Great debate. Bring it on. We've got a golden opportunity here to reset the way that we tax real estate and to make it more efficient, more equitable, and change the whole way that we've perceived this inefficient system. And I throw payroll tax into that as well, and I throw GST into that as well, and I try and come up with a system that actually works for everyone, federal, states, and the individuals as well. Should we be afraid of paying tax if we're making a profit? No, we shouldn't. Much better to pay tax if you're making a profit than have no profit to pay tax on. The system's got to work. And one of the great things, like Jeff Kennett, one of the great things about economic crises like this, it gives the ability for everyone to come back together and talk and use the sensible media to have a debate about what is the best for the long-term benefit of the country, socially, economically and politically. And I hope we get that debate in this. I really do. I could sit down tomorrow and put my version out. It's a version, it doesn't mean much, right? But we need a better system. And do I want to track the lost stamp duty and the lost, land tax and the money that slips through the tax net? Yes, I do. Because we need it. So we need a more efficient system. And that's going to take a while to debate, and there'll be a lot of political challenges in that, state, federal. But I think we're at the time now, it's a great opportunity to restructure. And we should use this opportunity. And now we're all talking around the table at a political level. We should talk about it, and we should put New Zealand in that too. It's time for big thinking right now.
Lastly, what sort of legacy does Bill Moss want to leave?
Look, Bill Moss, I've set out from day one to be different, be creative and try and change the world in a lot of ways. And I'm a supporter of the underdog, I always have been, and I want to get things done better and more efficiently. And if I can still be involved in new businesses, particularly through Boston Global, I'd love to see a legacy where from today I can have an effect on the health system. Love to see a better health system. Love to see a better utilisation of the global funding for health into things that not only prolong existence and keep the agony of suffering, and put into more efficient ways of actually stopping the disease day one. Love to see more money into research. I'd love to have an effect on that. If I had the energy, I'd be lobbying governments all over the world on that, but the reality is, if I did that, I wouldn't be doing it.